He noticed a massive aircraft carrier drifting straight toward the port. Only minutes remained before a disaster. But what he did next shocked everyone. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments which country you're watching from. The first light of morning crept over the horizon, soft and reluctant, as though the sun itself hesitated to rise over the vast navy-gray waters of Norfolk Harbor. A thin veil of mist slid along the surface, clinging to boats and pilings like a memory that refused to fade. In that slow-growing dawn, a small, weather-beaten fishing vessel named Mabel rocked gently against its mooring lines. Her hull bore scars of years at sea, patched seams and peeling paint, but she remained steadfast, seaworthy in the ways that truly mattered. On her deck, moving with the practiced rhythm of a man who had performed the same tasks more times than he could count, worked Elijah Moore. Elijah's day always began long before most of the city opened its eyes. He preferred it that way. When the harbor was quiet and the world seemed paused between night and daylight, he felt a sense of peace that rarely visited him during the bustling hours. He checked the fuel gauge, adjusted the ropes around stacked crab pots, and wiped the condensation from the radio that was mounted above the helm. He tapped the speaker once, a habit rather than a necessity, making sure the crackling voices of harbor traffic would reach him when needed. He didn't talk much these days, but he listened. Always listened. His movements were calm, methodical, shaped by decades spent on the water. Even his breathing seemed to match the tide, steady and controlled. Behind his dark, tired eyes lived a man accustomed not just to the sea, but to what the sea demanded: patience, strength, and sometimes silence. The silence, he had learned, could weigh as heavy as any storm. When Mabel finally slipped from the dock and set her course toward the deeper pockets of the bay where crab traps waited, the rising sun cast a metallic sheen on the surface of the harbor. It reflected off the towering silhouettes of gray warships that lined the naval base in the distance. Even from afar, the massive structures were impossible to ignore. They were floating fortresses, symbols of might and precision that dwarfed every other vessel in sight. To the people of Norfolk, they were a source of pride and livelihood. But to Elijah, they brought a different feeling, one he tried not to name. The waters around him rippled as seabirds circled overhead, announcing another day's work. Elijah steered his modest boat toward the markers he'd memorized long ago. His calloused hands wrapped around the wheel with easy familiarity. The Mabel's engine grumbled but responded loyally, as though reassured by the touch of its longtime captain. When he reached the first string of traps, he slowed to idle and prepared the winch, all while gazing into the hazy distance where cranes and piers rose like a jagged skyline. Other fishermen passed nearby, raising a hand or a nod. Elijah returned the gesture politely, but without invitation for further conversation. Most knew him only as the quiet crabber who kept to himself. To them, he was dependable, honest, and content with his little corner of the sea. They did not trouble themselves with questions of who he had been before. They didn't know that his hands had once guided supertankers longer than city blocks, nor that he had navigated ports across oceans. They didn't know he was once the man others looked to when weather turned vicious and visibility dropped to nothing. They didn't know because Elijah had never told them. He had folded his past away and stored it where even he rarely reached. On his deck, among piles of soaked rope and heavy cages, lay traces of a life more complex than fishing. A brass compass, polished meticulously despite its age, rested near the helm. It wasn't a tool he truly needed anymore, not for the familiar waters of Norfolk, but he carried it like a relic from another lifetime. Above it, a laminated chart with scribbled notes, currents marked with precision, lay tucked beneath the console. It was the kind of map only a harbor pilot would use, but that identity was locked behind the silent wall Elijah kept around himself. The radio, though rarely transmitting his voice, remained a constant companion. Through it came conversations of ships entering the harbor, channel assignments, maneuver commands, and weather advisories. Elijah listened and understood every detail, every subtlety in tone. The harbor's pulse beat through those transmissions, and he could feel it as vividly as if his own hands were still guiding a vessel through labyrinthine channels. Sometimes, when an especially large ship approached, a tanker or a destroyer, he would pause in his work, eyes narrowing against the glare. His mind drifted unconsciously into calculations, drift angles, wind vectors, tug requirements, depth allowances. He didn't try to think about it. He just did. But once he caught himself doing so, he forced his attention back to the traps. That part of him, he told himself, belonged to the past. The sea might remember his name, but the world had moved on. When his hold was partly filled with live, clacking crabs, he turned the Mabel toward the marketplace docks. Vendors were already preparing their stalls, ready for the morning's catch. The air grew thicker with the mingled scents of brine, fuel, and fish. Elijah docked and unloaded his bins with the help of a young dock worker named Mason, who often tried to draw him into conversation. Mason liked to chat, liked to dream aloud about bigger boats and adventures past the horizon. Elijah smiled faintly at the enthusiasm, but offered little in return. He didn't want to extinguish the boy's dreams by revealing what the sea sometimes demanded in exchange for granting them. Business completed, he returned home to a small, modest house overlooking the water. Inside, the rooms were neat, functional, and quiet. The walls held only a few photographs, one of Elijah and his late wife, Grace, who had passed years before, another taken even earlier. Two men in pilot uniforms, arms slung around each other's shoulders, both smiling broadly under the shadow of a massive cargo ship. That friend, that brother in uniform, was gone too. Elijah's gaze lingered on that picture the least. Some memories were too sharp to touch. Afternoons were short. He cleaned his gear, ate a simple meal, sometimes watched news segments about the naval base expanding or new warships under construction. Norfolk's lifeblood was the Navy. Stories of aircraft carriers and destroyers filled the screens, floating worlds of steel and power. The city fed on their presence. People gathered by the waterfront to take photos when a new ship arrived or an old one returned from deployment. One broadcast that played on the small television in Elijah's kitchen spoke of a new pride of the fleet, the USS Franklin Pierce, a state-of-the-art nuclear-powered aircraft carrier nearing completion of sea trials. News anchors portrayed it as a marvel, a titan meant to secure peace across oceans. There would soon be a ceremony to welcome it to Norfolk. Dignitaries, admirals, photographers, everyone would be there. Elijah sat back in his chair, arms crossed loosely. He watched the footage of the carrier cutting through bright waters like an unstoppable force. The sight stirred something inside him, a mixture of awe and discomfort. He had once helped guide such behemoths into ports across the world. He knew their weight, their slow but relentless inertia, the terrifying truth that even a slight error could send them hurtling into destruction. He had lived those consequences too closely. He turned off the television. The room fell quiet except for the whisper of waves brushing the shoreline outside. He stood by the window and looked out at the harbor glittering under the afternoon sun. The silhouettes of warships stood unmoving in their berths like silent watchmen. They reminded him not of glory, but of responsibility. Evening came, and Elijah found himself back at the docks, sitting on the edge of the pier as day melted into night. The rising moon cast pale reflections across the water. Far in the distance, the faint lights of the naval yard flickered, where the Franklin Pierce was likely being prepped for its arrival. His fingers absent-mindedly traced the wooden grain beneath him as old thoughts crept in. Maybe it was the news, or maybe the quiet, but something in his chest tightened, an ache he hadn't felt for years. There was a time when he belonged to a world defined by precision, trust, and the navigation of giants. Back then, he had believed there was no current he couldn't master, no vessel too large for him to guide. But a single night had shattered that certainty, replacing pride with guilt, purpose with withdrawal. He inhaled the cool night air and tried to release the weight of memory with it. The past was done. Tomorrow would bring more traps, more tides, another dawn. He was just a fisherman now. Nothing more. Yet the water did not forget, and beneath the quiet surface the harbor held secrets it would soon reveal, not to the proud or the eager, but to the man who thought he had escaped its call. The Mabel waited patiently in the faint glow of dock lights. Elijah eventually stood, brushed the salt from his hands, and walked toward home. He did not glance back at the sea. If he had, he might have noticed how still the water had become, the calm before something immense began to shift. A change was coming, carried quietly on the tide, and, whether he wanted it or not, the sea was preparing to pull Elijah Moore back into a world he had vowed never to return to. The night settled fully around the harbor, serene and unsuspecting, as if resting before the storm. The night before had slipped into memory, and morning returned once more with the familiar scent of brine and the muted hum of the harbor. For anyone watching Elijah Moore from the outside, nothing had changed. He woke before dawn, brewed the same bitter coffee, buttoned his faded flannel shirt, and walked down the narrow pier toward his waiting boat. His body moved by routine, but something in his expression was different, almost imperceptible, a flicker of thought behind his eyes that hadn't been there the day before. The news of the Franklin Pierce lingered somewhere deep in his mind, a quiet pulse beneath everyday habits. He pushed away the sensation as soon as it surfaced. Today was another working day. That was all. Elijah guided the Mabel out into the open water, chasing the tide as always. The sun stretched slowly across the horizon, gold brushing against the rippling waves, but its warmth failed to ease the tightness in his chest. It wasn't unusual for him to think about the past. Memories were stubborn that way, but today they pressed harder, refusing to be ignored. The sight of the carrier on the news, the way it moved so powerfully through the sea, had opened a door he had spent years bolting shut. As he pulled up his traps one after another, Elijah found himself moving through the motions without attention. The harbor seemed louder than usual. The clank of metal, the distant blast of horns, radios chattering across frequencies. Each sound had once been a part of his language, the lifeblood of his profession, something he understood more fluently than any spoken word. Even now, those messages threaded through his thoughts like half-forgotten memories rising through fog. He finished collecting his morning catch and headed back toward the docks, but instead of returning home after selling his haul, he lingered. Standing at the pier, he stared toward the naval shipyard, where cranes jutted skyward like angular skeletons. The massive shapes of destroyers rested behind high fences, their gray hulls catching only the sharpest slivers of daylight. Somewhere beyond them was the Franklin Pierce. The city buzzed with excitement for its arrival. Newspapers praised it. Commentators called it the future of naval superiority. Elijah saw more than that. He saw a vessel that demanded skill, that demanded respect, that demanded responsibility. One mistake could turn it into a nightmare of steel and catastrophe. The thought sent a chill through him, not because he feared the ships, but because he knew intimately what happened when responsibility was lost at sea. He closed his eyes, but the tide of memory surged anyway. It began in a different harbor, under very different skies. Years earlier, Elijah was not a quiet fisherman, but a rising star among harbor pilots. He had earned his reputation the hard way. Hours spent in classrooms and simulators, countless test scenarios where currents and winds were as unpredictable as fate. He learned from the best, and soon enough others began learning from him. Captains trusted him with vessels heavier than skyscrapers, each maneuver a delicate interplay of experience, instinct, and math. He loved the weight of responsibility then. It made him feel grounded, purposeful, part of something infinitely larger than himself. And he wasn't alone. By his side, more often than not, stood Michael Johnson, friend, brother in all but blood. Michael's laugh could cut through any tension. He saw the world with a fearless optimism Elijah admired and envied. When they guided their first massive ship into port together, they celebrated with wide grins and promises that they were only just beginning. Their futures were bright, wide open, invincible. Elijah had never believed in the word invincible, but with Michael it almost seemed possible. Then came the night that changed everything. A storm had rolled in faster than anticipated, heavy clouds suffocating the sky, rain pounding the deck like hail. The call came in the dark hours of morning. A fully loaded container ship was approaching ahead of schedule, and delays were unacceptable. The captain, a stern man obsessed with efficiency and reputation, insisted they proceed despite worsening conditions. Elijah was at the helm as harbor pilot, Michael positioned to oversee tug coordination and crew communication. Elijah warned about the risk. He recommended slowing down, altering approach, waiting for improved visibility. But the captain's voice overrode his. The chain of command was clear, and Elijah, despite every instinct screaming inside him, fell silent. He relived that silence over and over as the storm surged, as the darkness swallowed the harbor lights, as the ship veered just slightly off course. Just slightly. It was always the small deviations that killed. A shift in weight, a hidden current, a captain who believed they were stronger than nature. It happened fast, too fast to correct. A scraping, grinding horror as the hull struck the shoal at an unforgiving angle. Containers holding thousands of tons of cargo shifted with a roar, metal tearing as they toppled like dominoes. The deck lurched, alarms blared, crew members shouted orders drowned out by crashing steel. Elijah tried to regain control, barking commands into the chaos, but momentum had already betrayed them. In the aftermath, he remembered fragments more than details: the sickening tilt of the vessel, the twisted railing slick with rain, cold seawater flooding where it never should have been, and the broken shape of the sailor pulled from below decks, someone's son, someone's friend. And Michael had been exactly where he needed to be to do his job. He had stayed, fighting to correct the course even when escape was possible. His body was found hours later, lifeless and battered, his face still set in determination. That image haunted Elijah more mercilessly than any nightmare. Investigations followed, reports written, papers signed. He was cleared of wrongdoing. Officially, the captain's negligence was deemed the primary cause. But what comfort was there in legal absolution when a man he loved like family was gone? Elijah knew the truth. He had hesitated. He had doubted himself when he should have fought harder. His silence had cost more than one life. So he resigned. He walked away from the career that had once defined him. He turned down every appeal to return. He sold nearly everything that tied him to the harbor pilot profession, and he bought the Mabel, a small boat for a small life, a vessel that couldn't drag thousands into danger if he misjudged a tide or misread the wind. He believed that by shrinking his world, he could shrink the risk he posed to others. The years that followed blended into cycles of tides and seasons. At first, he felt raw, fragile, like a cracked hull held together only by will. But time softened the edges of grief, even if the core remained unhealed. Fishing gave him purpose. Simple, quiet, honest. No decisions with world-altering consequences. No lives balanced on his judgment. Just the sea and a few traps. Yet the sea kept whispering. As he stood staring towards the naval yard now, that voice grew loud again. It reminded him that he had once been trusted to guide giants, because he was good, very good, better than most. But it also reminded him of the cost of a single failure. That duality was the cage he'd constructed around his heart. He turned away from the view before the memories consumed him fully. Home awaited. His coffee mug would still sit by the sink. His worn armchair waited near the window. The quiet routine would continue, as it always had. But inside, he felt the shift, subtle yet undeniable. The kind of shift a pilot recognized instinctively, the moment currents changed direction beneath the keel of a ship. For the first time in many years, Elijah wasn't entirely sure he wanted the silence. Something deep within him, something he thought he had buried long ago, had begun to stir. Maybe it was the arrival of Franklin Pierce. Maybe it was the memory of how it felt to stand at the helm of a vessel that answered to his voice. Or maybe it was the sense that the sea had not finished with him yet. He returned home as the sun waned, but his mind did not rest. Even as he lay down to sleep, visions of towering hulls and radio chatter flooded his thoughts. Michael's laughter echoed in the back of his memory, making it harder to hold on to the walls he'd built. The moon washed the harbor in pale light, and the distant foghorns called out into the night like unanswered questions. By morning, the past would feel even closer, and the tide would bring with it not only fish and currents but a reckoning Elijah could no longer outrun. He closed his eyes and breathed, but rest would not come easily. The sea roared in silence behind his thoughts as if reminding him, "You were meant for more than this." And the water outside his window, calm, steady, and incredibly patient, waited for the moment when he would finally listen. Morning crept into the sky with a muted grayness that hinted at change before Elijah Moore even stepped out of his front door. He felt it in the air, a heaviness that wasn't quite weather, not quite intuition, more like the quiet pressure of the sea drawing a long breath. By the time he reached the pier, the gulls were already circling low over the harbor, their wings cutting through the stillness as though anticipating something unusual. Elijah paused just for a heartbeat, his gaze drifting once again toward the naval shipyard where distant silhouettes towered over the water. He forced himself to look away before memories from the night before could take hold. His hands worked automatically as he prepared the Mabel for departure. He moved with practiced efficiency, but his thoughts kept drifting, unanchored. He set off for his usual route, steering the boat into open water where the tide tugged gently at her hull. The sun, hidden behind a broad sweep of clouds, cast only a washed-out glow across the horizon. It was the kind of morning that felt undecided, neither calm nor threatening, just waiting. Elijah busied himself with retrieving the first traps. The winch clanked and rope scraped damply across the deck as he hauled up the cages one by one. His catch was modest but steady, enough to keep a man fed and his bills paid. The harbor radio murmured to life above him, idle routine chatter crackling through static. Tugboats relayed their positions. A supply barge requested clearance to pass. Everything sounded normal. Yet beneath that normalcy, Elijah felt tension coiling, subtle but undeniable. He was halfway through checking his second line of traps when he lifted his head almost involuntarily. Something in the edge of his vision tugged at his attention. There, a dark form materializing through haze, immense and unmistakable. Elijah lowered his tools slowly, wiping his palms against his jeans as he reached for his binoculars. He steadied them against the slight roll of the boat and pressed the lenses to his eyes. The USS Franklin Pierce. Even cloaked in morning mist, the aircraft carrier dominated the view like an approaching continent. It was a staggering thing, a city built on steel, surging through the water with the arrogance of sheer mass. Aircraft laced its deck like silent predators waiting to take flight. Antennae speared the sky from the superstructure tower. The ship's prow cut through the harbor with effortless power, but something wasn't right. Elijah frowned, setting the binoculars down only to snatch them back up. The carrier was moving at a pace too slow, too ungoverned. A drifting ship was deceptively silent, its momentum masked until it was too late. He scanned the wake for telltale turbulence from working propellers. Nothing. No push of water indicating controlled thrust. No shift of rudders guiding its course. The ship wasn't steering. His pulse quickened. He adjusted his stance, steadying himself as logic and instinct collided in his mind. The Franklin Pierce was heading toward the busiest quadrant of the naval base, an area thick with fuel tanks, ammunition stores, maintenance cranes, and workers already bustling through their morning shifts. A collision there wouldn't simply damage property. It would ignite chaos, fire, explosion, lives lost by the hundreds, maybe thousands. Elijah forced his breathing slow, though the weight inside his chest grew heavier. He raised the binoculars again and scanned the flight deck. Figures rushed about, hundreds of sailors scrambling, urgency in their movements. On the bridge, he spotted forms gesturing, coordinating frantically. They were working, trying everything possible, but the massive vessel continued drifting with implacable intent. A voice broke through the radio suddenly, sharp and commanding. "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is USS Franklin Pierce. We have suffered complete steering failure. Request immediate tug assistance. Thousands of personnel aboard. Drifting toward the naval yard. Emergency response needed." The broadcast cut through the harbor like a lightning strike. For a moment, Elijah didn't move. The binoculars lowered in his hands. His heartbeat thudded in his ears, every syllable resonating through him like a ghost of the past come roaring back into the present. Steering failure, drifting, tug assistance too far out. This was the nightmare scenario every harbor pilot dreaded. And the math began assembling itself unbidden in his mind. The angle of drift, the strength of current, the distance to impact. Approximately 15 to 18 minutes. That was all. From the radio, Harbor Control answered, their tone tight with barely masked fear. Tugboats were responding, estimated arrival in 40 to 50 minutes. Too late. He knew it the instant he heard the number. Too late by half an hour. Elijah set the binoculars aside and gripped the wheel, his breath trapped somewhere between his lungs and throat. He tried to push away the memory of another ship, another night, another wrong course that hadn't been righted in time. But the past flooded him anyway. Michael's face, his voice, his last struggle against inevitability. No, that had been different. Conditions, circumstances, all true. But the core truth was that he had seen disaster approaching then, just as he saw it now. And he had hesitated. That hesitation had cost everything. Elijah's knuckles whitened around the wheel. He whispered to himself, though he didn't fully realize he'd spoken aloud. Not again. The Franklin Pierce loomed closer. The harbor's fragile calm began to unravel around its silent advance. Alarms sounded faintly through the air. Smaller craft veered sharply to clear its projected path. The enormity of the situation pressed downward like a storm cloud waiting to strike. Elijah's thoughts raced with cold precision. The carrier's mass was too great to halt entirely, not without catastrophic consequences, but it could be slowed. Its direction could be altered just enough. Even a minor change in trajectory could mean the difference between a near miss and an unspeakable tragedy. But such a maneuver required leverage, the kind a swarm of small boats could provide if positioned meticulously. He reached for the radio microphone, but paused, his hand hovering. What would he even say? Who would listen? He was just a fisherman now, a man who had walked away, a man who had failed once before. But standing still would guarantee failure. Standing still would make him relive the same nightmare. Standing still would mean thousands would pay for his fear. He inhaled sharply. Then his fingers closed around the mic and the click of the transmission button felt like a trigger pulled. "This is Mabel," he began, voice tight but steady. "I have a visual on the Franklin Pierce. Harbor Control, I need to confirm, are all tugs en route? What is current ETA? Fishing vessel Mabel, this is Harbor Control. Confirmed, tugs dispatched. We are coordinating with Navy Command. Please clear the area." Elijah stared at the drifting behemoth. The angle had worsened. The timeline shrank. He tried again, firmer. "Harbor Control. I'm a former harbor pilot. 20 years of service. I know these waters better than most on shift today. You've got minutes before she hits something she can't afford to hit. You do not have the luxury of clearing the area. You need immediate correction." Static crackled. Someone on the other end hesitated. He pressed on, urgency sharpening his tone. "At her current rate and drift direction, she will impact the primary fuel reserves near Pier 11. You need coordinated lateral push, stern heavy pressure, at the port quarter. And you need it now." A silence heavier than any wave passed through the air. The voice that returned sounded younger. An officer, perhaps, or someone unaccustomed to overriding protocol. "Mabel, advise if you're offering assistance. You are a small craft." Elijah looked at his boat. Old, worn, barely a scratch compared to the mountain of steel bearing down on the harbor. But size wasn't everything, not when physics and positioning came into play, not when one life, his, didn't matter compared to thousands. "I am," he answered, "but I can't do it alone." Another pause, then, "Stand by." Elijah set the mic down and exhaled shakily, staring at the carrier that seemed impossibly vast. His mind mapped wind speeds, tidal surges, weight distribution across the hull. All calculations locked in with sudden clarity, the way they once had when he lived a life ruled by such knowledge. He could do this. He had to do this. As he pushed the throttle forward, the Mabel surged toward the drifting giant. The engine whined in protest, but Elijah coaxed every ounce of speed it could deliver. The sun broke through the clouds briefly, casting a sharp reflection off the carrier's hull, like a warning flash. He approached carefully, close enough now to see faces on the deck, tension drawn tight as rigging rope. Elijah called back into the radio. His voice no longer wavered. "Any vessels monitoring this frequency, this is Mabel. The Franklin Pierce is without steering. Tugboats will not make it in time. We need all available craft to assist in controlled push maneuver. Port side, stern area. Follow my lead." This is not request, it is necessity. There was no hiding the authority in his tone anymore. It had returned from the depths of his past without his permission. A pilot's voice. A voice used to being heard. For a moment, he feared silence, that he would act alone once more. But then the radio came alive. A fishing trawler volunteered, then a tour boat, a pair of crabbers. A small tug from the far side of the harbor promised they were closing rapidly. The responses spilled in quickly now, urgency growing like wildfire. People understood. Everyone in this harbor lived beneath the shadow of the Navy. They took pride in its ships. They would not stand by and watch one turn into a weapon against them. Elijah angled the Mabel into position, heart pounding, mind razor sharp. The Franklin Pierce towered above him, a skyscraper set loose upon the sea. The deck blocked the sky. The steel was a dark wall stretching endlessly in both directions. He felt tiny. He felt terrified. He felt exactly what he needed to feel to make the right choice. As his hull pressed against the carrier's steel flank, he braced himself, arms rigid, feet planted. The friction vibrated through the Mabel's frame like a warning, but it was too late to retreat. He eased the throttle higher, and the old engine roared stubbornly, pushing everything it had into slowing the unstoppable. The radio continued buzzing, other boats maneuvering, voices coordinating through chaos. The carrier was still drifting fast, too fast. Elijah's breath hitched in his throat. He closed his eyes, and then he pushed harder. He would not let fear steer him again. He would not fail this time. The sea rumbled beneath them. Metal groaned under pressure. Elijah gritted his teeth and leaned into the wheel, knowing that in a crisis, even a degree of change could rewrite the fate of thousands. From his vantage point beside the immense hull, he saw what others might not, a shift in angle so slight that most eyes would miss it, but not his. Franklin Pierce was turning, just a little, just enough, but only if they continued. Elijah opened his eyes, focused, and prepared himself, because this fight had only begun, and the margin for error had vanished entirely. The Mabel shuddered under the strain, her old engine roaring as though it were coughing up every last year of use in one desperate effort. Elijah gripped the wheel with both hands, his forearms tight with the strength he poured into holding the vessel steady against the towering wall of steel beside him. Above, the massive flank of the USS Franklin Pierce loomed so close that the sunlight barely reached the Mabel's deck, swallowed by the carrier's shadow. Elijah felt like an ant pushing against a skyscraper. And yet, he pushed. The radio crackled with frantic voices. Other boats were arriving, small fishing vessels, tour boats, and utility craft whose operators understood the stakes instantly. They didn't need to be convinced or commanded by rank. The sight of the giant warship drifting silently toward disaster was enough to unite them into a single force with a single goal: keep the ship off its deadly course, no matter the cost. Elijah's voice carried into the cooperative storm of transmissions, sharper and more decisive with every order he gave. "Maintain the angle. Keep stern pressure constant," he shouted. "Vessels on mid-port section, push at 45 degrees, compensate for drift." The commands came from somewhere deep inside, a part of him that had never actually died, only gone dormant. Each word reaffirmed his identity. This wasn't guesswork. This wasn't hope. It was controlled physics and hard-earned experience shaping a miracle out of desperation. Foghorn alarms blared from the carrier's deck, warning every ship and dock worker in the harbor that catastrophe was racing toward them. On the flight deck, sailors ran in organized chaos, securing aircraft and preparing emergency anchors. Elijah could hear shouted orders from high above, carried faintly by the wind. It reminded him of that night years ago, the storm, the voices, the panic, and for a second his breath caught. The memory threatened to crack his focus like lightning splitting a mast, but he forced himself back to the present. The past had already claimed too much from him. It would not take this moment, too. He was aware of every vibration through the Mabel's hull, every jitter in the wheel. The carrier's drift slowed only a fraction, but fractions were everything when a leviathan like this moved through confined water. Elijah's mind tracked the trajectory instinctively, revising, recalculating. There was progress, but not enough. Not fast enough. If they didn't alter more than just speed, the Franklin Pierce would still graze the outer piers, tangling steel upon steel and igniting a chain of destruction. They needed direction. They needed rotation. Elijah Moore, a voice suddenly boomed through the radio, authoritative and edged with desperation. It belonged to the Franklin Pierce's commanding officer, Captain Russell Kane. We are deploying portside emergency anchor. Confirm optimal moment of release. Elijah's heart slammed once against his ribs. They were giving him tactical authority, reinforcing the improvised fleet maneuver with the carrier's own emergency measures. One wrong calculation could rip the ship's hull or snap the anchor chains with deadly recoil. One correct calculation could add the rotational drag they needed. He inhaled deeply, letting the rhythm of the waves guide him for a heartbeat. Then he spoke. Deploy, anchor, now. A thunderous roar erupted as the massive chain unraveled, clattering into the sea. The tension in the air thickened as the anchor rushed toward the seabed. Elijah braced himself. When steel met earth, the collision was invisible but felt everywhere. The Franklin Pierce jolted, the Mabel shuddered violently, and the entire harbor seemed to hold its breath. The carrier's stern resisted the pull first, then yielded in a slow, grating arc that sent vibrations up Elijah's legs. "Vessels on stern section," he barked, voice cracking under the strain. "Increase throttle by 10%, now." The water churned white with boiling prop wash. Small engines snarled with effort. Metal against metal screeched, echoing through the bay like the groan of a wounded titan. Slowly, agonizingly, the carrier began to turn, its bow shifting away from the direction of the most vulnerable structures. Elijah's arms trembled as he held the Mabel steady. Pain flickered through his muscles, sharp and insistent. Sweat trickled into his eyes. His boat was fighting not just the momentum of the carrier, but the dragging torque of the anchor. An impossible battle of forces. The Mabel's engine wailed, coughing smoke as though clinging to life only through sheer refusal to quit. He glanced toward the docks. Workers had stopped running and now stood frozen, watching. Fear etched their faces, but beneath it, hope flickered. Elijah couldn't look long. If he saw those faces, those lives depending on him, the weight might become unbearable. He stared instead at the gray steel wall beside him, letting the enormity of the task fuel his focus instead of crush it. A deep clank shuddered through the Mabel. The first sign the old girl was reaching her breaking point. The wheel kicked and groaned. Elijah gritted his teeth, leaning his full weight into the fight. "Stay with me," he whispered. The boat responded with one more blast of power, engine shrieking. The Franklin Pierce's bow cleared the most critical point by what looked like inches. The anchor drag, combined with the swarm of smaller boats, continued to rotate the vessel into a safer orientation. But the forces tearing through every vessel involved were unsustainable. Elijah felt it in the flexing of the deck beneath his boots. He heard it in the popping rivets, smelled it in the rising smoke. A male voice screamed over the radio, raw and frightened. Someone's engine had seized on a neighboring boat. Another vessel fell out of line and drifted backward, slamming against the carrier's hull. The operator shouted but regained control. Elijah issued quick corrections, adjusting positions, filling the gap. They could not afford a collapse in formation. This was a chain, and the loss of one link destabilized all others. The noise of the anchor grinding against the seabed intensified, a metallic howl that cut through the air. The Franklin Pierce was nearly parallel to the dock now, a narrow escape forming by degrees so small they were barely visible. But Elijah saw every micro shift. He could tell exactly how much more they needed to give. He could also tell how little Mabel had left to give. Her engine sputtered violently. A plume of dark smoke billowed out. The temperature gauge had redlined long ago. Elijah ignored every warning, every instinct telling him survival meant letting go. He was not letting go. Not with Michael's face burning behind his thoughts. Not while this ship still moved. Not while his voice and his knowledge and his stubborn refusal could keep disaster at bay. Another violent tremor shook the Mabel. Something deep inside the engine clanged loudly, a wrenching, terminal sound. Elijah felt power drop beneath his hands. He slammed the throttle, begging, commanding, cursing, anything to keep her alive just seconds longer. The hole scraped the Franklin Pierce harder now, sparks lighting momentary flashes between steel and fiberglass. Water surged into the Mabel's stern through a fresh crack below the waterline, icy and merciless. "Elijah, pull back if you must," someone shouted from a nearby boat. Panic edged their plea. They could all see he was sacrificing everything, but Elijah did not pull back. If he let up now, they'd lose control. The ship would swing wide. It would tear free and resume its deadly drift. The fragile miracle they had bled for would shatter in seconds. He stayed. He fought. And finally, blessedly, the Franklin Pierce's motion eased into silence. The giant stopped. The sudden quiet was surreal. Engines downshifted, then stilled. Calls of command faded into disbelief. The world snapped into a motionless tableau. They had done it. For a heartbeat, Elijah could do nothing but stare at the steel wall of the carrier. It was like looking into the face of a beast finally tamed. Slowly, his arms slackened and he let go of the wheel. Exhaustion flooded him. Not just physical, but 20 years of guilt loosening its grip all at once. He glanced around and saw the boats he had called to action. Their captains stared back. Many he had never spoken to before, their faces filled with the same astonished relief. Then, faint cheers began rising from several decks, cautious at first, then swelling into triumph. Elijah allowed himself one small, tired exhale. And then Mabel, having given her last breath of strength, surrendered to the sea. The boat sagged beneath him as another seam burst. The deck tilted sharply. Water rushed in like dark fingers claiming their prize. Elijah snapped back to alertness, stumbling away from the collapsing stern. Before he could jump, a nearby trawler came alongside, its captain leaning over with arms outstretched. "Elijah, come on, man. She's going under." He hesitated only long enough to press one palm against Mabel's rail in farewell. The vessel that had carried him away from the pain of his past was gone now, but in going, it had delivered him into something new. Something he had nearly forgotten existed. Redemption. He climbed aboard the trawler just as the Mabel sank beneath the waves, her hull vanishing in a cascade of foam and bubbles. Elijah stood drenched, breath shaking, chest heaving. He stared at the patch of churning water where his boat had been moments ago. There was grief, but not regret. Above, high on the bridge of the Franklin Pierce, sailors lined the railing, looking down at him. Some raised their hands in salute. Others simply stared, knowing they had witnessed something extraordinary. The radio fell silent for several seconds, a pause that felt like the entire harbor bowed its head. Then Captain Kane's voice returned, lower and steadier. "Mr. Moore, the harbor and the United States Navy owe you more than we can ever repay." Elijah didn't answer right away. He looked toward the horizon, the clouds parting to let a sliver of clean sunlight spill across the sea. The light reflected against the side of the saved carrier, illuminating the colossal name painted there in navy blue letters. USS Franklin Pierce. Thousands of lives. A city saved. A disaster averted by seconds and resolve. Elijah swallowed the lump in his throat. His voice emerged rough but strong. "I only did what needed doing." As he stood tall on the deck of the boat that rescued him, soaked in seawater and sweat, a strange sensation washed over him, like the tide of fate turning at last. He was no longer running from the sea. He was part of it again. And this time, he would not hide from who he was. The harbor was still vibrating with the echoes of what had just happened. It wasn't sound anymore. Engines had powered down, alarms had ceased, radio chatter had faded into orderly communication. But the vibration lived in the air, in the stunned expressions of sailors peering down from the deck of the Franklin Pierce, in the white-knuckled hands of fishermen gripping their wheels, in Elijah Moore's chest as he stood dripping seawater on the deck of the trawler that had plucked him from the sinking remains of the Mabel. The adrenaline that had surged through his body moments earlier had begun its slow retreat, leaving behind something fragile and raw. Relief, disbelief, and the dawning realization that he was still alive. The Franklin Pierce loomed beside them, its hull now motionless, anchored, nudged, and wrestled into a position that no longer threatened to tear the harbor apart. For the first time since dawn, silence settled over the water, except for the gentle lapping of waves against steel and fiberglass. Men and women leaned over guardrails above, staring down at the small fleet that had refused to let them die. Some of those faces were pale, some streaked with tears or soot, others wide-eyed with what they'd narrowly escaped. They did not cheer loudly. This wasn't a stadium triumph. Their gratitude was voiced through raised hands, clasped fists, silent nods. They were alive. That was celebration enough. Elijah looked back toward the place where the Mabel had slipped beneath the water. Bubbles still rose lazily to the surface, marking her grave with a fleeting signature. A sting pressed behind his eyes, but he blinked it away before it could take shape. She had been old, tired, patched and repatched so many times that each creak had been a conversation between them. She had been his refuge, his livelihood, and his confessional. And she had held on until the very last second, given everything she had to save lives that would never know her name. Elijah lowered his head in silent respect, feeling the ache of loss tuck itself into the same place where he had stored every other scar. The trawler captain, a burly man with weathered skin and a voice that carried without effort, clapped Elijah on the back. "You did it," he said simply. "Not we, you." The small fleet had answered the call, yes, but everyone knew who had led them, whose calculations and unwavering command had steered a miracle into existence. Elijah wasn't sure how to respond. He wasn't even sure he wanted the praise. A part of him could barely process anything beyond the roaring need to sit down and inhale air that didn't burn. Before he could gather himself, a Coast Guard vessel approached, lights flashing though there was no longer an emergency. Officers helped transfer Elijah aboard, checking him over immediately. One of them, a young woman with kind eyes, placed a blanket around his shoulders. The warmth of it nearly broke him in a way danger hadn't. He murmured his thanks, his voice hoarse. As the harbor's emergency response forces swarmed into efficient motion around him, the trawler's captain called out, "We'll see you at the pier." Elijah nodded, and then the Coast Guard vessel sped away, carrying him toward the docks. Behind them, the Franklin Pierce continued to settle into its new position, sailors deploying auxiliary anchors and coordinating stabilization efforts. The city that had stood frozen in horror minutes earlier now buzzed with renewed energy. Phones dialing, cameras rolling, voices overlapping in stunned excitement. When Elijah's feet touched solid ground again, he was immediately surrounded. Not by reporters, not yet, but by men in reflective jackets and crisp uniforms who needed answers. Their pens moved as they questioned him. His name, his role, his decision-making process, the exact moment he recognized the danger. He answered with quiet clarity, posture straight despite his exhaustion. He described the drift angles, the tide chart he had memorized long ago, the leverage points against a hull of that size. The questions multiplied as different agencies arrived, each needing their own version of the truth. It was during one of these rapid-fire interrogations that Elijah noticed a figure approaching with a purposeful stride, a man in a Navy uniform, bearing the tired dignity of responsibility carried to its limit. Captain Russell Kane. His eyes were sharp but softened when they found Elijah. He looked like someone who had lived an entire lifetime in the span of 20 minutes. "Mr. Moore," he said, extending a hand, "we owe you our lives." Elijah hesitated only a moment before taking the offered hand. Kane's grip was firm, strong, but also filled with gratitude that words could barely contain. "You acted when others were still deciding what to do," Kane continued, "with no authority, no obligation, and at terrible personal cost. The United States Navy does not forget deeds like that." "I only did what anyone should have done," Elijah replied automatically, though even he recognized the hollowness of the protest. There were plenty of people in that harbor with boats and radios. Only one had stepped forward and taken command. Kane studied him a second longer, then nodded toward the sea. That vessel, and every soul aboard it, was inches from disaster. "You changed our course, literally." His voice dropped lower, reverent. "Thank you." Elijah swallowed, his throat tight. "I didn't do it alone." "No," Kane agreed, "but you were the reason they knew what to do. You gave them direction when we needed it most." He paused, then asked quietly, "Where did you learn to command like that?" Elijah looked past the captain toward the shipyard. Memories swirled beneath the surface like deep currents. Uniforms, charts, hard hats, a friend's laughter. "It was a long time ago," he said. Kane did not press, but his expression made clear that Elijah's past was no longer something he could keep buried. Hours passed. The Navy launched its investigation almost immediately, and Elijah was escorted to a private briefing area where he retold every crucial detail again and again. Engineers consulted his on-the-spot calculations and confirmed them with awe. Officers who had previously glanced over him now leaned in attentively, absorbing his every word. Elijah answered patiently, though each new retelling forced him to confront how close they had all come to tragedy. When the formalities concluded, they offered him a seat on a bench overlooking the water. By now, the sun had climbed high, turning the rippled surface into a sheet of shimmering light. Nearby, his rescuer, the trawler captain, approached with a paper cup of hot coffee. Elijah took it gratefully, letting the steam warm his face. "You lost your boat today," the man said, settling beside him. "Damn shame. That vessel had character." Elijah looked down at the dark liquid swirling in his cup. "She did what she needed to do, more than I had any right to ask." "That she did," the fisherman agreed. "But you lost your livelihood too. That ain't nothing." Elijah didn't answer, because for the first time in years he wasn't sure that was true. What he had gained, the self he thought had died, might have been worth more than what he had lost. He didn't have long to dwell on that thought before another familiar uniform approached. Captain Kane returned, this time accompanied by a Navy official with silver hair and severe eyes. The older man introduced himself as Commander James Foster, the senior investigator assigned to the incident. "Elijah Moore," Foster said, shaking his hand, "we were able to confirm your credentials. Former harbor pilot, 20 years of exemplary service, commendations for multiple crisis maneuvers, including averted collisions in the Panama Canal and Port of Oakland." His gaze sharpened. "Why did you leave the profession?" Elijah stiffened. The air suddenly felt colder. He didn't want to talk about that, especially now, especially with these people. But he had never been skilled in lying, and something about Foster's expression insisted on truth. "There was an accident," Elijah said quietly. "A container ship. We hit a shoal. Men died." He paused. "My best friend died." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "I should have done more. I didn't. So I left." Foster's eyes flicked briefly with understanding, not pity, just recognition. "You made the recommendations," he said. "Official records state your warnings were ignored by the captain. The primary fault was not yours." Elijah looked at the water, its movement suddenly too reminiscent of the way the sea had swallowed Michael. "It doesn't matter what the record says." Captain Kane spoke gently. "Mr. Moore, what you did today, it seems to me you've spent a long time punishing yourself for something that was not entirely within your control." Elijah didn't respond. He couldn't. Because for the first time ever, someone had said aloud the very thing he had feared to confront, that his exile was self-imposed penance. And maybe, just maybe, it had lasted too long. Commander Foster exhaled, shifting to a new subject. "There's something else." He pulled a small binder from his case and handed it over. Inside was a preliminary summary of the Franklin Pierce incident. At the bottom of the first page was a recommendation. Consider immediate reinstatement of Elijah Moore's harbor pilot credentials and urgent recruitment into advisory capacity for port crisis maneuvering. Elijah stared at the words as if they were written in a foreign language. Reinstatement, a return, another chance. Foster continued, "We have a maritime academy filled with young pilots who have never faced a situation like this. They don't know what it's like to have lives depend on a decision made in seconds. But you do. You could teach them what textbooks can't." Elijah's pulse stumbled. "I'm just a fisherman now," he said, the argument weak even to his own ears. "You're a harbor pilot, Mr. Moore," Foster corrected softly. "You always have been. Today proved that." Elijah could not respond. His throat felt cemented shut. Kane rested a hand briefly on his shoulder. "Take time to think it over, but don't let grief keep steering your course. You've earned the right to move forward again." They left him then, allowing space for the decision that would reshape what remained of his life. He sat motionless for a long time, staring out across the water, watching tugboats adjusting around the Franklin Pierce like small birds around a resting giant. The sun had begun to sink toward evening when a new figure stepped into his peripheral vision. Elijah glanced up, and his breath caught in his chest. The young man wore a Navy uniform, his posture straight, his eyes searching with a mix of hesitation and something far deeper. Elijah recognized him instantly, despite the years stretching between their last meeting. The jawline was stronger now, the shoulders broader, but the expression, vulnerable, hopeful, was exactly the one Elijah remembered from a much younger version of this man. "Dad," the young officer said. The word hit Elijah harder than the jolt of any impact he'd ever known at sea. His heart seized. His coffee dropped from his hands, forgotten. He stood slowly, uncertainty flooding him. His son, his own flesh and blood, stood before him in uniform. The very uniform Elijah had blamed for everything he'd lost. "Owen," Elijah breathed. They stared at each other, the years of silence and distance hanging between them like a rope drawn too tight. Owen's lip trembled as he took a step closer. "I watched the whole thing," he said, voice thick. "From the control room. I didn't know it was you until someone said your name." His breath shook. "You saved us. You saved my ship." Elijah felt the final wall inside him crumble. All the pride, fear, sorrow, anger, every fractured emotion, collapsed into the simplest truth. His son was alive, and Elijah had helped ensure that. There was too much to say. Too many apologies left unsaid for too long. Too many misunderstandings layered over too much love, but Owen closed the distance first, throwing his arms around his father in a desperate, relieved embrace. Elijah clutched him tightly, his eyes closing as tears he'd refused to shed for decades finally broke free. He held his son as though anchoring himself to the one thing that mattered more than ships, careers, or guilt. The price of saving a giant had been high, but the reward was priceless. When they finally stepped apart, Owen wiped at his eyes and smiled shakily. "Mom would be proud of you," he whispered. Elijah's breath trembled, but he smiled too, soft and certain. "I hope so," he said. He looked once more toward the harbor, the water calm again, as if the sea itself approved. For the first time in a very long time, Elijah Moore didn't feel like he was drowning in what he'd lost. He felt like he had finally begun to rise. Evening settled over Norfolk Harbor with a softness that felt almost unreal after the chaos of the morning. The sun dipped low, turning the sky into a gentle wash of peach and lavender, as if nature itself wished to soothe the wounds left behind. Elijah Moore stood beside his son at the edge of the pier, the weight of everything he had experienced pressing gently rather than crushingly against his heart. Owen had remained by his side since the moment they embraced, neither ready to let go again. It was a reunion forged by danger, shaped by courage, and sealed by the recognition that family could survive storms even when hearts broke along the way. They spoke quietly for a while, small fragments of 5 years' worth of unspoken emotions. There were apologies without words, forgiveness without ceremony. When Owen was finally called back to his ship for debriefing, he gripped Elijah's shoulder with a firm promise. They would see each other again soon. Elijah nodded, grateful that this time he didn't have to watch his son walk away with anger lingering between them. But the day was far from over. Elijah's presence was requested again, this time not for questioning but for acknowledgement. Captain Kane returned with several Navy officers and members of the Harbor Authority. They shook Elijah's hand, congratulated him, and thanked him personally for his leadership. Their gratitude felt strange against Elijah's skin. He was so used to hiding from the world that being thrust into its spotlight left him unsteady. Still, he accepted each gesture with grace, though his eyes often wandered back to the water, where the Franklin Pierce rested with its deck lights beginning to flicker on like stars. Later that night, Elijah lay awake in his own bed for the first time since dawn. He stared up at the ceiling, the room too quiet compared to the roar of engines and waves that had filled the day. His hands twitched, still remembering the wheel, the vibration of metal, the pressure of the sea against the hull. He tried to breathe normally, but his heartbeat would not slow. The adrenaline was gone, yet the purpose remained. A truth echoed through him with relentless certainty. He no longer belonged to the shadows of his past. He had stepped forward when he needed to. He had refused to freeze. He had been the man Michael once believed he was. And the sea, once a judge that cast him out, had welcomed him back with open tides. Sleep finally found him, heavy and dreamless. Morning brought a new world. News vans lined the harbor. Cameras pointed out over the water. Headlines flashed across televisions. Small boat saves U.S. carrier. Harbor pilot hero returns. Miracle in Norfolk. Elijah avoided the reporters skillfully. He had no desire for fame, but the harbor community found him easily. Fishermen who had answered his call came to shake his hand. Dock workers clapped him on the shoulder. Strangers passed him nods of respect. His quiet existence had been rewritten overnight. The next few days passed in a blur of investigations, memorials of gratitude, and reunions. Owen visited each evening, sharing meals and stories about the Franklin Pierce that Elijah listened to with cautious interest. The distance between them shrank until it felt as though those painful years had been only a long pause, not a severed connection. One morning, Elijah arrived at the docks to find a Navy tugboat approaching. Behind it, a vessel glided across the surface, sleek, new, and pristine. Its white hull gleamed under the sun, the crisp blue trim a sharp contrast against the dark water. Elijah frowned, blinking as the boat drew closer, and then closer still, until the name painted in elegant gold lettering came into full view. The Grace Moore. His wife's name, the woman who had stood by him through storms both literal and emotional. The woman who had held his hand after the accident and promised him he would heal, even though he hadn't believed her. She had died before seeing that healing come to pass. Now her name floated proudly on the bow of a ship built to honor everything Elijah once sacrificed. Captain Kane stepped forward from the vessel's deck, smiling in a way that suggested this moment had been planned with great care. The Navy and the harbor community wanted to do something meaningful, he said. Something that recognized not just what you accomplished yesterday, but the decades of dedication you gave long before that. Elijah took a step forward but stopped when emotion tightened his throat. The Grace Moore was beautiful. Longer than the Mabel, stronger, equipped with radar, reinforced hull, and engines capable of real power. She was both a gift and a message. He was not meant to disappear into a life too small for his spirit. Kane continued softly, "We hope she'll help you return to the sea in the way you truly belong." Elijah ran a trembling hand along the railing. The metal was warm beneath the sun. He felt his wife's memory in every inch. It was overwhelming, How a man who had lost so much could find himself standing at the edge of a future he never thought he deserved. "Thank you," he managed, voice strained with heartfelt sincerity. He looked up at Kane. "I don't know what to say." "You've already said it," Kane replied, nodding toward the harbor. "Yesterday, with every call you made, every risk you took." After the officials left, Elijah stayed aboard the Grace Moore, exploring each compartment slowly, reverently. The wheel felt familiar under his hand. The deck creaked beneath his boots as though welcoming him home. He sat in the captain's chair and exhaled a long breath he felt he had been holding since the day he left the harbor pilot's office forever. This boat was more than a vessel. She was a second chance. In the days that followed, Elijah agreed to the proposal laid before him. Not a full return to harbor piloting, not immediately. He needed time to adjust, to learn how to navigate his life again before guiding giants into narrow corridors. But he agreed to mentor at the Maritime Academy, sharing his knowledge with young pilots who would one day face their own moments of truth. He wanted to prepare them for the terrifying responsibility of command, not in books or simulators, but in heart and judgment. Standing before his first class, Elijah felt nerves tingling in his fingertips, the room buzzing with the eager energy of students who looked at him not as a washed-up fisherman, but as someone who had done the impossible. He played for them footage captured from harbor cameras, the Franklin Pierce turning, creeping past disaster with only feet to spare. The classroom fell into awe-filled silence. It wasn't bravery that saved that ship, Elijah told them. It was action. Knowledge means nothing if you're too afraid to use it. Fear does not disqualify you. Freezing does. The students scribbled furiously. Elijah hoped they didn't just write his words, but understood them. He continued teaching week after week, and with each lesson he felt the weight inside him lighten, replaced by purpose that no longer hurt to carry. He spent mornings fishing again, breathing in the quiet of the sea from the deck of the Grace Moore, catching just enough to keep things simple. Then he turned to training and advising harbor pilots, shaping a legacy Michael would have been proud of. Months passed. Norfolk Harbor returned to its steady rhythm. The Franklin Pierce, fully repaired and operational, sailed again, this time with Elijah and Owen standing together on the pier, watching her glide into open waters under control, unstoppable but safe. One crisp afternoon, Elijah piloted the Grace Moore beyond his usual fishing grounds, letting the engine stretch its muscles. The radio sat quietly at first, broadcasting weather updates and routine checks. The sea sparkled with sunlight, and Elijah felt that old thrill, the sensation of belonging to something infinite. He heard it before he fully registered it. A voice on the emergency channel, tense but not panicked. A small vessel calling for guidance. Their navigation equipment had failed, and they were disoriented near a narrow jetty. Elijah did not hesitate. "This is Grace Moore," he responded calmly, hands already adjusting the wheel. "Maintain position. I'm on my way." The voice on the other end sighed with relief. Elijah smiled to himself. Not proud, just ready. He navigated swiftly, eyes analyzing wind and current without conscious effort. In minutes, he spotted the distressed boat and guided it away from danger with the practiced authority of a man who had never truly left the helm. When they were safe, the grateful captain called out his thanks. Elijah waved it away, letting the sea carry the sentiment wherever it wished. The sky above him was a radiant blue, the kind that made the water seem endless. Elijah inhaled deeply, the salt air filling his lungs like hope. He looked out toward the horizon, where ocean and heaven blended seamlessly, and for the first time in years he felt whole. He spoke softly, letting the wind carry his words. "I'm here, Grace. I'm still here." The Grace Moor rocked gently beneath him, the sea whispering its steady promise. The past no longer owned him. The tide that once pulled him under now carried him forward, and Elijah Moore, harbor pilot, fisherman, mentor, father, had found his course again. He chose the sea, and this time he chose it freely. If this story moved you, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next unbelievable tale. Click the video on your screen for another story that will leave you speechless. And share this video with someone who needs to see what real courage looks like.